Slavery has been a deplorable institution that has existed in various forms throughout human history. In the ancient world, the practice of enslaving other human beings was widespread and considered a normal part of society. However, the reasons and justifications for this practice were complex and often deeply rooted in the social, economic, and cultural norms of the time. One of the main causes of slavery in the ancient world was the practice of war and conquest. When armies defeated their enemies in battle, the vanquished were often taken prisoner and forced into servitude. This was seen as a way for the victors to extract labor and economic benefits from their enemies, as well as a means of subjugating and controlling populations. The ancient empires of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome all engaged in this form of enslavement, with captives from conquered territories being brought back to imperial centers and forced to work in the fields, mines, and households. Another common justification for slavery was the notion of cultural or racial superiority. Many ancient civilizations believed that certain groups of people were inherently inferior or uncivilized and therefore deserving of subservience. This ideology was used to rationalize the enslavement of indigenous populations, such as the subjugation of the Carthaginians by the Phoenicians or the exploitation of the Britons and Gauls by the Romans. The idea of a natural hierarchy among human beings was deeply rooted in the worldviews of many ancient societies. Slavery also served as an important economic institution, providing a constant source of work and wealth for the ruling classes. Slave labor was used in a wide range of industries, from agriculture and manufacturing to domestic services and construction. Slave ownership was a sign of status and power, and trading in human beings was a profitable business. This economic incentive was a significant factor in the perpetuation of slavery, as the profits generated by forced labor were seen as essential to the prosperity of ancient civilizations. In addition to these practical and ideological reasons, the religious and philosophical beliefs of the time also played a role in shaping attitudes towards slavery. Many ancient religions, such as Hinduism and certain strands of ancient Greek thought, accepted the notion of a divinely ordained social hierarchy in which some individuals were destined to serve others. This theological justification for servitude further entrenched the practice of slavery in the ancient world. Some additional historical examples of how slavery was justified in various ancient civilizations. Ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, slavery was a common practice that was often justified through the lens of religious and cultural superiority. Prisoners of war captured during military campaigns were often enslaved and put to work building great monuments and infrastructure for the pharaohs. The Egyptians also justified the enslavement of the Nubian and Canaanite peoples, considering them inferior and uncivilized in comparison to the advanced Egyptian civilization. Ancient Mesopotamia. Slavery was deeply rooted in the social and economic systems of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations such as Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria. Debt bondage was a common form of enslavement, where individuals who defaulted on loans could be forced into servitude to pay off their debts. Military conquest was also an important source of slaves, with captives from wars being incorporated into the workforce. Mesopotamian religious texts and legal codes often sanctioned the ownership of human movable property. Ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks had a complex relationship with slavery, which was widespread throughout their city-states. The Athenian philosopher Aristotle argued that some people were natural slaves who were inherently suited to servitude due to perceived intellectual or cultural disabilities. The ancient Greeks also justified the enslavement of prisoners of war, as well as those who were sold into slavery for debt or criminal prosecution. Ancient Rome. Slavery was absolutely central to the economy and social structure of the Roman Empire. Slaves were acquired through military conquest, piracy, debt, and the kidnapping of people from the outskirts of the Roman world. Roman thinkers like Cicero and Seneca debated the ethics of slavery, but ultimately accepted it as a necessary institution. Slaves were forced to work in fields, mines, homes, and even in the Roman military. The shift from the enslavement of mainly foreign captives to the incorporation of national populations into systems of slavery had significant impacts on the social and economic structures of ancient civilizations. Here are some of the main ways this transition occurred. Greater control over the workforce. When slavery expanded beyond foreign prisoners of war to include domestic populations, the ruling elite gained tighter control over the available labor force. This allowed them to more effectively direct the workforce towards large-scale projects such as infrastructure, agriculture, and industry, fueling economic growth and the accumulation of wealth and power. Disruption of social mobility. The enslavement of national populations, including citizens, has eroded opportunities for social mobility and access to economic resources. This solidified the divide between the slaveholding elites and the subjugated masses, making it more difficult for the lower classes to improve their circumstances. Destabilization of family and community structures. The enslavement of domestic populations often involved the dissolution of families and the breakdown of local communities. This had profound psychological, social, and cultural impacts, undermining the traditional social fabric of these ancient societies. Racial and ethnic tensions. As slavery became more closely linked to the exploitation of specific ethnic or cultural groups, it contributed to the development of harmful racial and ethnic hierarchies. This, in turn, has fueled resentment, conflict, and further marginalization of certain populations. Increased resistance and rebellion. The expansion of domestic slavery also generated greater resistance and rebellions among enslaved populations. Slave revolts, such as the revolt of Spartacus in ancient Rome, posed significant threats to the stability and control of the ruling classes. Economic vulnerabilities. Reliance on a large domestic slave labor force made ancient economies more vulnerable to disruption, labor shortages, and social unrest that could arise from the exploitation of their own citizens. The transition from primary dependence on foreign prisoners of war to the incorporation of domestic populations into systems of slavery had significant economic consequences for ancient civilizations. Here are some of the main impacts. Increased productivity and production. With a more easily available and controlled labor force, ancient economies were able to dramatically increase the scale and productivity of agricultural, industrial, and infrastructural projects. This fueled economic growth and wealth accumulation for the elite classes. Distortion of market dynamics. The availability of cheap, coerced labor through domestic slavery disrupted normal market forces, as the true costs of production were not accurately reflected in the prices of goods and services. This made it difficult for free labor to compete and led to the marginalization of independent producers and artisans. Vulnerability to social unrest. Reliance on domestic slave labor made ancient economies vulnerable to disruptions caused by slave rebellions, labor shortages, and social unrest. This instability could have serious economic consequences, as witnessed by events such as the revolt of Spartacus in ancient Rome. Decline in technological innovation. The ready availability of slave labor reduced the incentive for technological innovation, as there was less pressure to develop labor-saving devices or improve productivity through mechanization. This could have long-term implications for the economic competitiveness and dynamism of societies that depended heavily on domestic slavery. Distortion of trade and commerce. The exploitation of slave labor distorted international trade patterns, as goods produced by coerced labor could undercut competitors' prices. This led to tensions and conflicts with other ancient civilizations, potentially disrupting important trade networks. Globally, the transition to domestic slavery had the effect of concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few, while undermining the dynamism and resilience of ancient economies. This contributed to the complex legacies and lasting impacts of slavery in the ancient world. This is a question without a simple answer, as the economic benefits and long-term risks of domestic slavery in ancient civilizations were highly nuanced and varied between different societies and time periods. There are arguments on both sides. Economic benefits of domestic slavery provided a readily available, low-cost workforce to supply large-scale agricultural, industrial, and infrastructure projects. It allowed the accumulation of wealth and resources among the elite classes, financing the construction of great monuments and the expansion of empires. Distorted market dynamics in favor of slave elites, giving them economic advantages over independent producers. Long-term risks and instability. Concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, leading to growing economic and social inequalities. Vulnerability to slave rebellions and social unrest that can disrupt economic activity and productivity. Reduced incentives for technological innovation and efficiency improvements, stifling long-term economic dynamism. Distortion of trade and commerce, potentially leading to conflicts with other civilizations. Psychological, social, and cultural harm to subjugated populations, undermining the stability of society. It is difficult to say whether the economic benefits of domestic slavery outweighed the long-term risks and instability it caused. Different ancient civilizations likely experienced varying degrees of each, depending on factors such as the scale and duration of slavery, the strength of social institutions, and the resilience of their economic systems.